but I'll call this meeting to order. This is the Policy and Finance Committee. First item up is to approve the May 10 minutes. I'll entertain a motion.
So moved.
Second, okay. Motioned and seconded. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes. Okay, Mrs. City Attorney, we're discussing the remaining articles of the Personnel Code.
We are. Thank you, Councilmember Cohen. So what I sent you yesterday were the final 3 articles of the Personnel Code. It's Article 8, Article 9, and Article 10. And 8 pertains to non-disciplinary reduction in force, 9 pertains to disciplinary actions, and 10 pertains to grievances. So I guess what I wanted to discuss with each of you is what your thoughts might be as to perhaps including this type of information into the personnel manual that's more administrative in nature. Did you?
We don't have copies of that.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, please.
Oh, okay.
Please.
Yeah.
All three copies.
Please.
Yeah.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Sorry. My bad, I didn't
Or do
bring
you
hard
need
copies.
Brendan?
I'm good, I'm sorry.
2.
Yeah.
So.
Got one of them fancy electronic ones.
I'm still a hard copy
E-paper.
person. So we can talk a little bit about just some of the charter provisions that we discussed earlier. I don't think Councilmember Emerson was present for maybe the first meeting where we talked about this, but the charter provisions that went into place after the form of government changed basically outline what the powers and responsibilities of the governing body are. And A2-25, entitled Powers of the Governing Body, says in the very last sentence that it shall have no administrative powers. And then as you go on to A2-28, subsection C, it talks about council members dealing with appointed officers and employees who are subject to the direction and supervision of the city manager solely through the city manager. So as we were going through some of the provisions in the Personnel Code, which was adopted back in 1991, originally, actually, some of the provisions were taken over from the TMC into the code, but the code came into being in 1991, I believe, or is that right? 1991 or 2011, I can't remember. 1991, it's been a long time. Some of those provisions contain, I guess, more administrative responsibilities that really should be in an administrative document. So that's kind of where we wanted to talk about, especially in these last 3 chapters that deal with reductions in force and disciplinary actions and grievances, what pieces of those particular articles you think you'd be comfortable with putting in an administrative versus a policy-related document. And the policy, as we've discussed before, should probably go into the code, the municipal code itself, rather than being in a separate personnel code document. So did I say that okay? I don't know if anybody else has anything to add, so. We'll wait for Sean.
Is there anything we can go over until we get the pieces?
Well, we don't have a lot of the questions that were raised at the last meeting addressed because we had such a short time frame because we just met last Friday. But if you guys have anything that you'd like to ask as far as clarifications from any of the subjects we've talked about before, we'd be happy to talk through them.
So there's always some discussion as to, just like you said, the governing body members have no authority over staff, but to my knowledge, it's not well documented how that works when we're interacting with you, the city attorney, with our assistant, Liz, and how the mayor works with her assistant. I mean, I realize that it just sort of works now, but it's not well documented. And if there's ever an issue, with the governing body and, say the city manager, for example, how does that work? Because there is supposed to be separation of powers, but at the same time, the governing body has to have city resources that, I don't want to use the word allegiance, but if there needs to be some closed-door meetings about the city manager without staff in there, there's not a clear line of authority there.
I
understand.
I believe at this point in time, just by virtue of the contract that you have that authority over the city manager.
With the city manager, yes, but I'm talking about administrative staff that would be necessary if there was an issue with that contract. You know, like you work directly for the city manager, not for us. Well, if we need you to be our attorney and not his, how does that work? Or is the council required then to go out and procure its own legal representation if there's an issue with the contract that needs to be discussed?
The duties of the city attorney are listed in the code just very broadly, but there are provisions in the governing body rules that talk about the duties of the city attorney as it pertains to the city council, the duties of the city clerk as it pertains to the council, and the duties of the manager as it pertains to the council. So, I mean, that's an age-old question, Councilmember Jensen.
And
A
you
lot
feel
of
that's
people have
probably
asked
locally
it. There's
needed?
not a good answer to it. I mean, there just isn't.
Okay.
So, for instance, on the contract with the city manager, the legal department drafted the contract, kind of talked with the incoming city manager about the terms of that contract, and then it was presented to the body and it was implemented. So,
Right, and I'm not saying we have any issues now, I'm just, if
right.
there's an issue in the future.
But that's a legitimate question.
How do we plan for that? And another concern I have, you know, Liz works for us, but she also works and does projects for the city manager and other staff in the city as time allows. Well, how does that work in terms of priority and hierarchy? That's not well documented now. And, you know, we all, for lack of a better term, have a gentleman's agreement about how all this works, and it's been effective thus far. I don't know if as part of this review, we need to formalize that anymore.
Well, I don't know if Jackie can speak better to this, perhaps she can, but I know that in the position descriptions for the mayor's executive assistant, and I believe for the council executive assistant, I don't even know if I have the titles right on that, but it does kind of outline what the duties and responsibilities are, and I believe in the executive assistant for the mayor, that individual serves at the pleasure of the mayor. So,
Yes, that is correct, and that's what I was going to mention. I think that the position description sets out the priority of duties and responsibilities, and with both of those positions, those are given to the council and the mayor.
And I'm fine. What I'm trying to get away from is a situation where people in the future are looking at, you know, this just sort of works for us now, and they're looking at it going, well, I don't, you know, we could have Liz do exclusively city council things and not do anything else for the rest of the city, unless it's documented specifically how her roles and duties lay out. If it is in the position description, that's fine.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
It's pretty specific. It even allocates percents of time that are spent on certain duties and responsibilities.
Excellent. Just trying to see where we're going to have problems in the future, or where we could, and if we need to try and work around that as we go through this.
and just, I mean, as just a question for me then, the position descriptions for the council assistant, does that go to all the members of the council? Or are
Actually,
they-
this current position description, we all worked together and went through it pretty detailed and recently revised it. And then Sean sat down with Liz and went through it with her to make sure that she's got a good understanding. So I think it's good to do that at least periodically, because priorities change, duties might change with different priorities. And so I would see that interactive process with the council is very beneficial and necessary.
Absolutely. Well, for one thing, then we all know what she's able to do for us.
Right.
Right. Okay. All right, so each of you should have the copies. I think it should start with page 53 of the Personnel Code, Article 8, Non-Disciplinary Reduction in Force. So as we go through these sections, if any pop out at you, like, you know, you'd like to question more about how it works, or, you know, administratively versus what role the governing body might have, you know, jump in and ask. But, you know, this just basically talks about the order of separation, if there's some kind of reduction in force, and then, of course, seniority enters into it, how that person is reemployed if he or she is laid off, or reinstatement, how they receive notice. So these are all fairly administrative in nature, but I wanted to go through each one of these just to make sure that you had a good understanding of what's in here. It talks about the benefits during layoff, and then the grievance process for that. So that talks about Section 1, and then as you get into Section 2 on page 57, this talks more about permanent reductions in force, and then that's where we get into the severance pay piece, which I think is probably a very good example of language that, should be in the code codified somewhere because it has a budgetary impact. And the governing body probably would like to have some type of oversight in that particular situation. So under permanent reduction, of course, it just goes generally through how it will work in the order of separation. Then in subsection C is where it starts talking about the severance pay piece on page 58, and that continues on to page 59 and on to pages 60. Talks about benefits and grievance again there. So then there's an administrative leave section, section 3. When we looked at this, administrative leave is really, authorized or put in place more so when it comes to a disciplinary matter. If there's some kind of investigation that needs to take place before, the type of discipline is imposed, or if any discipline needs to be imposed. So we thought that this made more sense to move from section 3 of Article 8 into Article 9 at the very end.
Sure.
And then you get into Article 9, which deals with corrective and disciplinary actions. And here's where you get through progressive discipline, first offense, second offense, third offense, fourth, and the procedure for going through discipline and what process needs to be followed. So again, this is fairly administrative in nature. So go
And
ahead.
this only
Ask
affects,
questions.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, Mrs. Robertson, and I understand what you're saying there. My only issue is in reading through this, it says, an administrative leave is not considered a corrective or disciplinary action. And we'd be putting it under the section that says corrective and disciplinary actions.
I'm going to let you take that, Jack.
It's a challenging, so we use administrative leave to determine whether or not disciplinary or corrective action is necessary. It's generally used during an investigation, and then we're determining a policy infraction and what level of infraction. Or it is used once we've determined that termination is necessary, but there's a time gap between the employee having an opportunity for a due process hearing prior to the termination action being finalized. And so it, from my perspective, it doesn't fit with the reduction in force, and I think that discipline makes more sense because it's a precursor to determining discipline.
Okay.
I don't know if there's another section
I totally
that-
understand what you're
yeah.
saying. It's just that it specifically says
That it's not,
like it's
and
not this, and to put it under that section then seems
And
counterintuitive.
it's not, it's just that time frame, and we use it pretty sparingly when it is not possible to conduct a thorough investigation with the employee remaining in the workplace. And it's not disciplinary because it's with pay versus a disciplinary removal from work would be more of a suspension.
Would it make more sense? I mean, can we just simply have a new article that just has
Quite
this?
possibly.
Again, this is just for,
Right.
it's almost semantics a little bit, but I
Exactly.
just thought it would be, if
We
you have it
had
in
that-
that section, then
we've-
you argue that it's not that, it needs to be in that section, but it explicitly says it's not. So I could see someone saying that, well, it's listed under this, so it is something that I can take to the grievance.
I think that makes a lot of sense. We struggled with this because it just
did.
didn't fit into any existing place, really.
Don't we use this all the time when there's a use of force review in the police department?
I don't know that it's used all the time for use of force, but certainly for officer-involved shootings, absolutely.
So I'm glad that you raised this because we did have a lot of discussion about where to put this particular provision. And one of the other options, I don't know if we talked about it, extensively, but is under the leaves and absences piece. And perhaps we could put it there, and that might, if it's a leave, employees are going to go there, I think.
Yeah.
So that might be a good option.
Sure.
So we'll look at that.
Okay, thank you.
So back into disciplinary actions. If there's any questions, this really goes into pretty good detail about what the disciplinary process is right now.
And this is only for at-will employees?
Pardon me?
This is only for at-will employees?
It's
Benefit
not, it's for those benefit eligible employees that are not covered by a bargaining unit. So the at-will employees are the department directors only. The other employees covered under the personnel code are not at will.
Oh,
But both department directors and employees covered under the code could be subject to disciplinary action under this policy.
well, what's the proper term for a person who's not part of a bargaining unit then that's not at will?
We generally say that they have civil service protection under the personnel code. Because the code provides those, and the Topeka Municipal Code specifically states that department directors serve at the will of the city manager. So that's where the at-will
I
status
see.
comes from.
Okay, good to know. Learned something new today.
There's also a reference to Parks and Rec in here. Okay.
Councilmember Emerson
Let's
just
strike
brought that up.
out. Yeah.
Yeah.
And do we still have a Human Relations Commission that has an executive director? Okay.
Yeah.
I think we do.
So
yeah.
reference to the Human Relations Commission, and I think that the Department of Neighborhood Relations is worded the wrong way, and then again, utilities would need to be added because we have a utilities department now.
So one thing I don't
That's the
see in
administrative
here
word.
is
Yep.
Great.
levels of egregiousness for violations. I mean, it looks like a cursory glance at this would indicate that everybody gets 4 strikes, regardless of the egregiousness of an action.
And moving on, kind of starting on page 62, under number 3, are examples of offenses that are not normally serious enough to warrant immediate suspension or termination. But then when we move over to page 63, number 4, those are examples of things that would be sufficient and just cause for immediate suspension or termination. And these are not all-inclusive lists, they're just natures of, to kind of provide a guideline for consistency when you have a specific circumstance that you're facing. So certainly, for example, the improper use of leave time would be more of a progressive step where you would get that verbal, written suspension, termination. But then when we come over here, dishonesty is dishonesty and theft.
Yeah.
That's something that there's less tolerance for, and it's, generally a suspension, if not an immediate termination without a prior offense having occurred.
Is there, go ahead.
Okay. No, I'm sorry, you asked a follow-up. Go ahead.
Is there a better way to mirror the private sector's approach in some of this? Because I get a lot of flack from people that see an employee that the private sector would have terminated for cause long ago, still employed at the city for various reasons. And there's a lot of frustration that we do that here.
I think that it's maybe a past perspective.
It could be.
I think that in the time that I've been here, I've really seen accountability ratchet up, and I think that there's a lot of things that contribute to that. It's having more professional management in place that are able to manage employees, and we really rely and use this language, and we have tried to be reasonable but accountable at the same time.
Excellent.
And from my perspective, I think that we have gotten a lot more similar to what the private sector does in that way. Certainly, the civil service protection does require a few more steps
Sure,
in certain
sure.
circumstances. But I would tell you that we are we've worked on consistency across departments as well, and I think that collaboration with management and human resources has helped greatly.
Excellent.
In that area.
Okay, good enough for me.
Yeah, Tony.
Thank you. And thank you for that. My issue is, in my mind, a lot of the things that are under 4 are actually very similar to these things under number 3. For instance, improperly using or obtaining leave time, to me, that is dishonesty in any form or degree. Destruction or loss of city property could be theft of property belonging to the city. Is it?
Parsing errors there.
They do go hand in hand. Sometimes there's multiple violations associated with one circumstance. So it is very common, in addition to these things cited here, that there might be other policy infractions. For example, code of conduct issues might come up, or bullying in the workplace that are accompanied by these things. So that's one of the things that, that's when HR gets involved, and that's one of the things that we help the managers navigate, and then that, whatever that strong underlying current is, if it's one of those things that are then over here that would rise to the level to immediate suspension or termination, then that's where we're at. But we always cite the lower level things, because if there's a future infraction, maybe it is just on its face, it's just improper use of leave time. It would progress based on it being cited in the larger issue. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
It does. When I see something like improperly using or obtaining leave time, that sounds like someone was dishonest, unless it was they didn't know the rule or something.
and sometimes it could be dishonesty, or it could be that they didn't follow the proper notice requirement. So they called in sick and they were supposed to give an hour's notice, and they only gave 5 minutes notice or something like that. And so that's why I say there's other rules that generally
Okay.
couple along with
Okay.
these.
How do,
Thank
sorry,
you.
go
Oh,
ahead.
I just have a question about, so do we cover anything about employees that, let's say, commits a crime or something on their personal time? Like even a felony. Do we have anything related to that?
That's something that we've been working with in the bargaining unit agreements, but where if there's a conviction, there's nothing in the code today that addresses convictions after employment.
That's true, but the code of conduct does cover off-duty conduct. And if that off-duty conduct impacts your city job in some significant way, then it can be the
Okay.
basis of discipline.
Okay.
This is a perfect example of where, in the private sector, it's almost always
out.
automatic termination because of the image that you have portrayed on that company, whether you're guilty or not. And I think that frustrates some folks that, whether you're guilty or innocent,
And
you
Catherine,
don't represent the way the city wants to look.
You might
So-
speak to this a little better than I do. One of the big differences between a private employer and a public employer is those constitutional rights of employees, and that's why they have those termed as civil service protections. So it's challenging to deal with charges versus convictions unless it's really overt, because of that need to try to see the process through and not interfere with the employee's civil rights, constitutional rights. But once there is a conviction, then we start collaborating together to find out. And there's also some EEOC rulings on whether or not it relates to the job that they do. So for example, if an employee was convicted of fraud or embezzlement, but they don't have any dealings with finances for the city, it would be hard to make that connection that it had a significant impact on their ability to do their job if they didn't have any ability to impact that on behalf of the city.
And that's true, but public perception is where we would struggle with something like that. And I don't have the answer, or I'm not advocating for one way or the other. Just this is the feedback I've received. And maybe this is where administrative leave comes into play in a more aggressive fashion, is we're going to move to isolate the employee from the city until this situation is worked out.
And that does, it could be appropriate sometimes based on the position that the person holds. And what we try to balance is not creating liability for the city. And sometimes, it's real gray.
Yeah. How does the disciplinary process work when a claim is filed against the city because of an employee's actions? Somebody damages property while out doing their city job. A lot of people get upset that, the taxpayers had to pay to clean that mess up, and the employee still kept his job or her job.
It depends on, what it is. Sometimes that's a performance issue, and it might be addressed through performance corrective action. And sometimes it could rise to the level of a neglect of duty that, caused harm or potential harm to the public. And those sorts of infractions could be egregious enough to rise to the level of immediate termination. So the hard part is we have to look at each of those individually on its face and then evaluate the situation.
It's tough in any case because there's two sides to every story, always. And often, we as the public's representatives will only ever hear the constituents calling to say, well, blah, 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 ran some truck into something and he kept his job. And, well, what we didn't find out was the brakes on the truck failed because we didn't have the money to do proper maintenance or something like that. But, that part of the story never gets out in the public.
And sometimes there's a perception created because, and this is what we try to avoid, but sometimes we've taken a termination action and then the employee has grievance rights, and through the grievance process, it's binding arbitration, and the arbitrator awards the employee their job back. And so the public doesn't necessarily know what the city attempted to do in the beginning and what that final outcome was.
When that happens, how do you reintegrate an employee that's been quote unquote fired and then unfired? And I mean, that would just seems like that would be very awkward.
It is awkward and challenging, and generally what HR does is we'll try to sit down with the employee and their supervisor and set out expectations, So we try to say, we're moving forward from this point. This is what's expected, and this is what we expect of you, and we're putting the past behind us. You need to put the past behind you, and we need to move forward. But it's generally something that is not easy to manage moving forward.
I don't envy you all for that.
I think that's just the natural drama that comes with dealing with people,
Yeah.
Okay, ready to continue?
So Jackie mentioned just a moment ago the performance-related corrective action. There is a whole section in the disciplinary piece, Article 9, that deals with performance-related corrective action. And I think all of this language is really covered in a current ARR. This is the only piece of Articles 8, 9, and 10 that would be, because we have an entirely ARR dedicated definitely to performance evaluations and probation. And it's a lot more clear and succinct, but this is just one piece of it, the performance-related actions. So, I mean, this really could just come out because it's already covered in the performance evaluation and probation section. But, and that goes clear through almost the end of 65, and then we're into Article 10, which is the grievance procedure, which is what Jackie just alluded to. After the discipline occurs, then employees do have the right to grieve the discipline if they choose to do so. And this is a very explicit article that kind of outlines all of the steps that they need to follow to file a grievance, and all the notice provisions that need to be met, representation issues, and then it goes through each of the steps. There's a sequence of steps that need to be followed in order to properly process a grievance procedure, and HR deals with this quite a bit. And then there's a piece on management rights on page 70. It talks a little bit about that, but this is strictly grievance procedure, and I think the arbitration provision is step 5, I think, in that process, which Jackie mentioned just a little bit ago. It's the very last step.
Bless you.
If you have any questions about the grievance procedure, we could talk about that, but these are the last 3 articles, and these are the only ones, with the exception of the one ARR that I just mentioned on the performance corrective actions, that are not addressed in other administrative policies that have been adopted over the course of the last couple decades. So if we put together a document that we want to refer to as a personnel manual, and we plug all of those previously adopted ARRs and policies in there, these last 3 articles of the personnel code really probably need to just be taken from the code and put into that document in order to make it flow clear to the end of the process, which would be the grievance process. So we just kind of wanted to, because there's not policies in ARRs we adopted administratively, kind of wanted to talk with you about that and see what your thoughts are, if that's something that would be okay with you all.
What, again, what year did the city manager form of government begin?
2004.
That's just a shame that all of this has just been left for whatever here,
For
16
us.
years. Yeah, for 15 years for us to do.
What's that?
For us.
2011?
Fate was waiting for.
Yes, that was the last change. So in one of the first meetings that we had, we kind of went through the history of the personnel regulations, where they started with an ordinance and the TMC, and then how they got lifted and put into a separate personnel code in 91. And then between 91 and now, the code has really not been revised in a way that's been meaningful or substantive.
Okay.
It's just done things like when the city manager form of government came into place, the only thing that they did correspondingly in the personnel code was take out references to, I think it's chief administrative
yeah,
officer, and put in city manager, and taken references out to, just those little, I don't know, they're not substantive in nature at all. So
Okay.
I guess that's kind of why we're here, because it really hasn't been addressed, and I know it's a massive undertaking, and believe me, we appreciate you guys kind of hanging in there with us, but we really think it's something that needs to be done.
So what would be the next course of action? What would we do here? Recommend these changes to the council and we'll vote on it?
Well, what I think at our next meeting on June 3rd, we've talked a lot about what does make sense for the governing body to have input on, because there are some things that deal with personnel matters that the governing body should have input on. For instance, residency, that's an issue that the governing body should have input on. So those types of issues, like right now, residency's addressed in the personnel code. That's something that we would say, if we repealed the personnel code, we need to lift that and put it into the TMC. Severance pay issues, we need to lift that out of the personnel code, put it in the TMC, and then kind of restructure a whole separate article in the TMC under the Title II, which is the administrative matters. Just have this whole separate article that talks about employees or personnel matters or something, and then just lay in all of those policy-related matters that pertain to personnel, whether it be residency, severance pay, what have you. So that's kind of what we want to do at the next meeting on June 3rd, is to bring all of the pieces of Title II that currently deal with employees to you and show you how they're structured now, maybe suggest some restructuring that would make more sense. Because right now there's different chapters in Title II that deal with personnel-related matters, and we kind of, like for instance, I think it's 2.125 that deals with the eligibility lists, I think, for police and fire, and there's another one that deals with civil service process. So we would just, I guess, recommend that we pull all those little chapters and put them into one chapter. So anything personnel related would be right there. Kind of like what we're doing with the personnel manual. Take all those little pieces and put them into one document. Except that would be the policy document.
Excellent.
So that's what we would propose to do at the June 3rd meeting, kind of bring the TMC provisions before you and just kind of start walking through that in the same way we've walked through the personnel code,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
Very
But we're open to suggestions on if there's some different route you think would make more sense. We're definitely open to that. So just let us know. But at this point in time, I think that's what we're proposing.
Okay, very good.
Sound good? All right. So we'll work on the questions that came up on Friday, because there are a couple of follow-ups that we owe you. So we'll work on those and we'll provide those to you on June 3rd. And then we'll get some information together on the TMC and start working through that. All right. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Are there any more items before the committee today? All right, meeting's adjourned.
Sure.
$1 million meetings be like that.
We're still